Recently, my husband and I traveled a short distance to northern Indiana. I can't usually travel very long because of my chronic pain, but this was only an hour, and as a sort of unusual thing, we did that to go to a music concert. While we were on the way there, we were driving through the countryside. We weren't on a expressway at this point, and I looked off to the side and I said, "There are camels in that field over there." And Tim looked, and sure enough, he saw too. There were camels. And we were driving by pretty quickly, but I also saw some cattle with some really big horns. I looked it up later, and it turns out that there is a small animal park there. I hope I'm not going to get anybody in trouble by mentioning this, the existence of an animal park in northern Indiana that has camels. But it was for real. And I was imagining 2,000 years later, if someone were reading an account of our drive, and my saying, and I looked off to the side and saw camels in a field, they would say, camels out in the middle of the countryside in Amish country in Indiana in 2025? You've got to be kidding. That just would never happen. It must be some kind of literary allusion that she's making or something, but no, they were really literally camels. I use the phrase a priori history to refer to judgments that something could not have happened a certain way, particularly because I use the phrase in a negative way. I mean this to be the opposite of a compliment when I say someone's engaging in a priori history. So I particularly use it in places where we're not even talking about some miracle, and we're not even talking about something, completely bizarre. Usually I use it for places where there's some social custom involved. And it's like a complex social question. Would this really have happened, or would that really have happened? And the document, usually, a gospel or the book of Acts or something like that, has some claim to actually be telling us about the customs of that time. And instead, the scholar will just dismiss it and say that would never have happened. So an example here would be the statement that the fourth gospel could not be written by John the son of Zebedee because he was a fisherman from Galilee, and it looks like it's speaking of that beloved disciple in John 18, and it says that he was known to the high priest, and that there's just no way that a fisherman from Galilee could have been known to the high priest. The word itself could mean anything from bosom buddies to mere acquaintances. It's got a big range, but no way, he would not have been. And that's a social question, right? It's a question of how social classes interacted and what circumstances there might have been during which the son of a Galilean fisherman could have gotten acquainted, even just acquainted with the high priest. But no, it's just dismissed. He couldn't have known the high priest. That's a really good example of a priori history. And what we've been discussing in our series about engagement with the Pharisees gives us another really good example of a priori history. Craig Keener, in his commentary on John, strongly questions the historicity of three things that John says in the series that we're talking about today. He questions the historicity of other things as well, but in the series that we're talking about. One is that the Pharisees sent messengers to ask John the Baptist who he was, if he was the Messiah, and why he was baptizing. So he questions that the Pharisees would have had the authority to do that. In John 7, he strongly doubts that the Pharisees would have even joined with the chief priests in sending temple officers to try to arrest Jesus. And then similarly, John 18, he doesn't think that the Pharisees were involved in the coalition with the chief priests to send officers that actually arrested Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, because he says the Pharisees wouldn't have had that kind of clout to even be involved with the chief priests in sending those arresting officers. Okay, now that is a classic example of a priori history. It's not a miraculous claim that we're making. We're not even talking about some kind of anti-miracle bias. It's a social question. What kind of influence did the Pharisees have? With whom would they have ever cooperated under these circumstances, and so forth? And so instead of just saying, well, we have other reason to think that the Gospel of John has some access to these kinds of facts. Okay, interesting. John attests that the Pharisees did send messengers, were involved in sending arresting officers. Okay, that's got claim to inform our notion of the activities of the Pharisees in the time of Jesus' ministry. No, instead he rules it out. And that's really a problem. And what we're going to see in today's video is that he persists in ruling it out, even when he acknowledges that there are passages in Josephus that seem indirectly to support the kind of social situation that John describes. And so at that point it becomes really weird, really surprising, and it just leaves one sort of gasping and grasping. Why does he do this? Why is he so insistent on this? Well, it's just the strange grip of a priori history. So I'm going to start by reading the passage in John 1 where the Pharisees send messengers to talk to John the Baptist. This is the testimony of John when the Jews sent to him priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, "Who are you?" And he confessed and did not deny, but confessed, "I am not the Christ." They asked him, "What then? Are you Elijah?" And he said, "I am not." "Are you the prophet?" And he answered, "No." Then they said to him, "Who are you, so that we may give an answer to those who sent us? What do you say about yourself?" He said, "I am a voice of one crying in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord, as Isaiah the prophet said." Now they had been sent from the Pharisees. They asked him and said to him, "Why then are you baptizing if you are not the Christ, nor Elijah, nor the prophet?" And then he gives an answer. We'll be talking about his answer a little bit more next week. And I should say right here that today I'm going to talk about Dr. Keener's a priori history argument. And next time really will be the last in this series where I'll talk about his redaction critical argument. Because these are what's left at this point. We've seen that the statistics don't match the claim of development in more and more engagement with the Pharisees, more and more negative portrayal of the Pharisees. Just doesn't match up to the statistics. The bare fact that the word Sadducees doesn't appear in John's gospel pretty much means nothing, especially since John includes other groups anyway. He just doesn't happen to name them Pharisees. He just doesn't happen to name them Sadducees as opponents of Jesus, and even Mark only uses the word Sadducee. So what's left? Well, the two kinds of arguments that are left, at least that John did some kind of invention of Pharisaic involvement, are a priori history, that'll be this time around, and redaction criticism, that'll be next time around. All right, and so there's that passage I just read in John 1, and in John 7:32, it says, "The chief priests and the Pharisees sent officers to seize him. On that occasion, they don't seize him because they're so impressed listening to him speak." In John 18:3, Judas then, having received the cohort and officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. So this is the actual arrest of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. All right, so here's some of what Keener says. I'll be reading more. The Gospel's Jews who sent the priests and Levites, 119, were Pharisees, 124. Now he's saying that's how John portrays it. But early first century Pharisees as a group did not exercise authority over priests and Levites. See also comment on 732. And then a little later he continues, yet the Pharisees hardly controlled the priests of Jesus' day, whereas some successors of the Pharisees appear to have been gaining an increasingly dominant role in the Palestinian Judaism of the Fourth Gospel's day. Rabbis who were mainly successors of the Pharisees later sent formal messengers to other dignitaries, but the practice is well attested in this period and earlier only of the high priestly temple hierarchy of those with official authority. And so he's saying, and he emphasizes that the priests were mostly Sadducees. He refers to them as Sadducean. And so he's saying that the Pharisees wouldn't have had that kind of official authority. And there's some overreading going on here. I'm going to come back to that a little bit later. But his point is that that's not what really happened. It wasn't the Pharisees. All right. Similarly, that the Pharisees and chief priests would join one another in sending officers, 732, compare 18:3, however, attributes to the Pharisees more political power than they were known to have in Jesus' day. It probably reflects John's own historical situation in which Pharisees had achieved greater dominance among the Judean religious elite. So, in other words, John's making up that the Pharisees did these things. It wasn't Pharisees. You know, if anybody did these things, it wasn't the Pharisees who did them. Okay. Now it looks for a moment like he's just making a bad argument from silence when he says it's only well attested in this period of those with official authority and so forth, or attributes to the Pharisees more political power than they were known to have in Jesus' day. Now that would be bad enough to say, well, we don't have any specific attestation of Pharisees sending people somewhere in some other non-biblical account like that. Super specific social interaction has to be of that exact type, has to be attested elsewhere, or else we're going to question it. Okay, that would not be a good argument. But it's worse than that. In fact, it's much worse than that. Because even though we shouldn't demand this when we do have it, it's a nice thing to have, we actually do have passages in Josephus that do attest the Pharisees sending people. Okay, so it's just crazy that the Pharisees being involved as part of that Jerusalem elite that he's talking about and sending messengers. Okay, so there's a passage in Josephus' autobiography, his life of himself. And I'm not going to read every bit of it, but every bit of this passage, but to summarize a little bit. At a certain point in Josephus' life, he was a little nervous because the Jewish people were wanting to rebel against Rome, and now, Josephus may be exaggerating how hesitant he was about rebelling against Rome. I've talked about that in another video, but as he presents it here, he wanted to calm them down, okay? And what he says is that he went and spent some time with, he says, I abode among the high priests and the chief of the Pharisees. And then he says that they became afraid when they saw the people in arms, so that they were made nervous by this. And so then later he says, and this is right around the same time, when Gessius had been beaten, that's a Roman, there had been a skirmish, the principal men of Jerusalem, seeing that the robbers and innovators had arms in great plenty, and being informed that all Galilee had not yet revolted from the Romans, but some part of it was still quiet, they sent me and 2 others of the priests, who were men of excellent characters, in order to persuade the men there to lay down their arms. Now, I want to just emphasize something here. Josephus was both a Pharisee and a priest. So the groups are partially overlapping. We don't even know that the priests and Levites who went to ask John the Baptist questions were definitely not Pharisees. Keener often emphasizes that modern scholarship tends to think that the majority of the priests were Sadducees. Okay, whatever, maybe. But we don't know for sure that those particular priests and Levites were Sadducees as opposed to Pharisees. And Josephus himself is an example that you could be both. The point I want to make here is he's just seemed to list who these principal men of Jerusalem are, the high priests and the chief of the Pharisees. That seems to me to be an implication. These are coming close together. That group, that coalition, sends Josephus and two other priests to try to calm the people down in Galilee to prevent them from rebelling against Rome. So here we have Pharisees who are influential working together with priests, presumably including priests who are not Pharisees, to send messengers. Okay, so there's no problem, right? And this is before the fall of Jerusalem. Then Josephus also describes a situation later in his life when an influential Pharisee named Simon induces the priestly leaders in Jerusalem to try to get him out of his position of authority in Galilee. So it's all this kind of drama and politics. There's a guy named John of Gischala who hates Josephus, and he's friends with this influential Simon, son of Gamaliel. Okay, and so he says, this Simon, son of Gamaliel, was of the city of Jerusalem and of a very noble family, of the sect of the Pharisees. And then Josephus actually kind of compliments him for his prudence. All right. He was also an old friend and companion of John's, but at that time he had a difference with me. When, therefore, he had received such an exhortation, he persuaded the high priests, Ananus and Jesus, the son of Gamaliel, and some others of the same seditious faction, to cut me down, now that I was growing so great. In other words, to try to remove him from his position of authority in Galilee. So here's a Pharisee who's so influential, this Simon, son of Gamaliel, so influential that he can go in the politics and drama of Josephus' life to the high priests and say, hey, you guys, let's get rid of this Josephus guy and not let him have such an important position in Galilee anymore. And they're like, okay, they go along with that. So once again, we see the influence of the Pharisees. In fact, that influence is actually borne out in the book of Acts. And I want to give a shout out here to a reader named Michael. Michael, if you're watching this, I'm making use of your idea because I hadn't thought of it in these terms. He wrote to me and mentioned, apropos of this series here, Gamaliel in the early chapters of Acts. Gamaliel, who was the teacher of Paul, definitely a Pharisee. He's automatically part of that Sanhedrin council, that ruling council that's getting together to decide what to do about Peter and John and the other apostles who are testifying that Jesus rose from the dead. And he counsels them not to kill them. Okay, so, and they go along with that. They beat them and they warn them, but at that time they don't kill them. Now, Gamaliel obviously has a lot of influence there. So all we need to be talking about, even in John 1, is a Pharisaic element within the ruling religious elite there in Judea that can be said to act to say, hey, we want to send some messengers to ask this guy, this John the Baptizer, who he is and why he's baptizing, so that when those priests and Levites are sent to ask him that, they can be said to be coming from the Pharisees. It doesn't have to be, the entirety of all the Pharisees. It doesn't have to be, certainly doesn't have to be that they're sending them against their own will or something, but and for all we know, they could have, some of them could have been Pharisees themselves, but they refer to those who sent them, and they want to bring back answers. It's not really that big of a deal. All right, now what's really strange is that Keener cites this passage in Josephus when he casts doubt upon the historicity of these passages in John, and yet he somehow brushes it off, even though he knows there's this evidence that supports this kind of social situation that we find in John. So I'm going to back up here and reread, and now I'm going to include the place where Keener acknowledges this passage in Josephus. Okay. Some Pharisees were involved in some such missions. Before 70, priestly leaders, perhaps with some Pharisees, Josephus, Life 21, that's one I just talked about, sent 3 priests to try to bring Galilee to peace, and the Galileans had to heed them. To restrain Josephus, Jerusalem's chief priest sent some learned aristocrats, including 3 Pharisees, one of whom was a priest. Yet the Pharisees hardly controlled the priests of Jesus' day, whereas some successors of the Pharisees appear to have been gaining an increasingly dominant role in the Palestinian Judaism of the 4th Gospel state. So he just blows it off. Or here, concerning 732 and 18:3, I'm going to read again, that the Pharisees and chief priests would join one another in sending officers, however, attributes to the Pharisees more political power than they were known to have in Jesus' day. It probably reflects John's own historical situation, in which Pharisees had achieved greater dominance among the Judean religious elite. At the same time, he's about to admit that what he just said is false, but he doesn't seem to realize that he's admitting that what he just said is false. At the same time, Josephus is clear that many Pharisees were influential on account of their wealth, as well as respected by the people, and the chief priests did work with the more influential Pharisees as joint members of Jerusalem's municipal authority. And then he cites those passages in Josephus' life. That Jesus encountered some Pharisaic opposition is difficult to doubt, but gospel writers after 70 CE had greater reason to emphasize Pharisaic participation in the aristocratic coalition, historically dominated by Sadducees, most directly involved in Jesus' condemnation. So he starts the paragraph saying that they would even join, that it's doubtful that they would even join with the chief priests in sending the officers, that it attributes more political power to them than they were known to have in Jesus' day. But then he goes on to say that in Josephus we find the chief priests working with influential Pharisees as joint members of Jerusalem's municipal aristocracy. So what do you mean? That to say that they joined with them in sending the arresting officers attributes to them more power than they were known to have. You just admitted that Josephus recounts just such a situation. It's really strange. So he isn't just making an argument from silence, which would be bad enough. He isn't just doing a certain amount of a priori history, but he admits that the Pharisees were probably part of the ruling coalition at the time, and yet he won't back down for some reason. We also see in John 7, we see that Nicodemus, who's said to be a Pharisee, is part of this group that wanted to arrest Jesus, and they're annoyed when the officers come back in John 7, they haven't arrested Jesus, and he's sort of arguing with his other the other members of that council that sent people to arrest Jesus. And so unless Nicodemus' role is completely invented out of whole cloth, it looks like he's integrated into the ruling council. Now they make fun of him, they don't back down. And John also says that in John 9 there was a dissent among the Pharisees, so people take different positions on that. But the point is that this ruling group, as pictured in the Gospel of John, consists of both Pharisees and priests. And that's very, very similar to what we find Josephus telling us. Okay, now it seems like the only way that Keener tries to go about maintaining his objection to these bits in John about sending messengers or sending guards is by massively overreading what John says. So after citing these passages in Josephus, he says, yet the Pharisees hardly controlled the priests of Jesus' day, or early first century Pharisees as a group did not exercise authority over priests and Levites. Now, nothing in those passages of John says that the Pharisees as a group are exercising authority over the priests and Levites, and certainly not over all of the priests and Levites as a group. It just says that the messengers were sent to John the Baptist and that they were sent from the Pharisees, all right, and that the temple guards were sent by the Pharisees and by the chief priests. That's it. To say that they controlled the priests is just overreading it in order to maintain some kind of pointless historical objection to those passages. The closest that Dr. Keener gets to trying to cite something that he thinks actually says that the Pharisees didn't have power to send messages is this. He cites in a footnote E.P. Sanders, who in turn cites a passage in Josephus, something Josephus wrote called Against Apion. And so this passage is supposed to show that the priests were, the main rulers at this time prior to the fall of Jerusalem. Now, Apion was an Egyptian who apparently had attacked Judaism. Josephus is writing to sort of defend Judaism's customs and so forth against Apion. And in the passage that Keener cites Sanders citing, all Josephus is doing is just saying that it's good that God set up a theocracy. He actually even uses the word theocracy, in which the priests are the rulers. So it's like a religiously ruled form of government. He's defending that in general, that's good. That's a good thing. He doesn't say anything, he doesn't get into any nitty-gritty about, how many priests were Pharisees, how many priests were Sadducees, whether Pharisees were part of the ruling coalition prior to the fall of Jerusalem, even if they weren't priests, or whether there were some Pharisees who had influence, who could send messengers. Like, he doesn't get into any of that. It's all being done in this very high level of generality, that no, it's a good thing that God set up priests as rulers. And this is being cited, even though interpreting it as saying, only the priests ruled and the Pharisees didn't have power to send messengers. They couldn't be, part of sending messengers or guards or anything. That would go counter to Josephus himself when he tells about actual specific nitty-gritty historical events. So, you shouldn't use it that way. That's the closest we get to any kind of independent argument that this is not what really happened, that this couldn't happen, that this wouldn't happen, and so forth. Notice, too, that Dr. Keener says, but gospel writers after 70 A.D., or CE he uses, had greater reason to emphasize Pharisaic participation in the aristocratic coalition, etc. Okay, and he doesn't just mean emphasize, mind you. He doesn't think that they were involved in sending these messengers. He's just said it probably reflects John's own historical situation. So this isn't just an emphasis, this is an invention. Okay, and apparently he thinks it's a good reason for that, to call it an invention, despite the Josephus passages, just because, well, John would have had more reason to emphasize this, because the Pharisees were, now we're back to the Pharisees were probably, persecuting John's audience. And so, He could make his gospel seem more relevant to them by saying that the Pharisees sent the officers who arrested Jesus along with the chief priests, and that's going to make his audience feel seen, as it were. Some people ask me why I emphasize so much the poor arguments of fellow Christians. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood. Dr. Craig Keener is a very sincere Christian. He is a believer. I am not denying that. But his scholarship is wrong at quite a number of places. So why do I emphasize that? I find that laymen are understandably impressed when someone they deem to be a fellow believer, someone they've even thought of as being somewhat conservative in his scholarship, says that a gospel author changed some facts. Because they'll think, well, if so-and-so believes that, there must be some really strong arguments for it. Craig Keener wouldn't think this. Craig Evans wouldn't think this. Michael Licona wouldn't think this if there weren't strong arguments, because after all, they don't have an anti-supernatural bias. That's the only bias we can think about here, right? But it's understandable, and people will capitalize on that. Dr. Licona very explicitly does so. I've seen him do it time and time and time again, Why don't you listen to these scholars? Sometimes he's even tried to co-opt someone, specifically D.A. Carson, for fact-changing literary devices, which is wrong. I mean, Carson doesn't even advocate those at all. But I've definitely seen him do it with Dr. Keener. And I understand that when you feel you can't get into the nitty-gritty, you have to kind of go along at this meta level. That could sound strong. Wow, this really sincere Christian scholar believes that John inserted the Pharisees into something where the Pharisees weren't really involved. Gosh, he must know what he's talking about. He's so learned and so forth, and plus he's a Christian. And what I want you to see is that the arguments that impress Christian scholars for fact-changing, deliberate fact-changing by the gospel authors are no better than the arguments that impress non-Christian scholars, like Bart Ehrman, for example. In fact, in some cases, all too often, they're the very same arguments. Okay? So that you won't think that anymore. So that even if you hear that someone you respect as a Christian scholar has conceded that someone, one of the gospel authors changed some fact, you're not just going to go, oh boy, must have a really good argument. I guess I just have to go along with this. Find out what the argument is. Be prepared to get in there, get your hands dirty, and dig in before you decide that you're just forced to agree. Because he's a Christian. I'd say do this about me too. If there's something you just hear Lydia McGrew thinks that, and it sounds dubious to you, don't just believe it because you heard that I think it. By no means. Feel free to find out what the reasons are and make your own judgment about whether those are good reasons or not. But in particular, you need to know that even Christian New Testament scholars are part of that discipline. And that discipline is epistemologically very, very messed up. And so, unfortunately, they're inclined to accept and then to promote very poor arguments for deliberate factual change on the part of the gospel authors. And next time we'll be seeing more of that in the case of attempted redaction criticism, to argue that John is inserting the Pharisees in places where they weren't really acting. So please like and subscribe. This is unique content that you're getting here, and come back next time to the Lydia McGrew channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.